History hides truths that most people never want to face. Some events were so devastating they rewrote the rules of civilization itself. By the end of this countdown, you will understand not only how fragile our world really is, but how each catastrophe forced humanity to adapt, rethink, and sometimes rise again. What happens when a single plague, a single war, or a single act of cruelty reshapes the fate of millions? Could you look at progress the same way after learning what it cost? A health crisis unlike any before it swept across continents, leaving societies forever changed. The bubonic plague, known today as the Black Death, arrived in Europe around the middle of the 14th century, carried along trade routes from Asia and through North Africa. In just a few years, it claimed an estimated 25 to 30 million lives in Europe alone, roughly one-third of the entire population. Entire villages vanished, fields lay untended, and the rhythm of daily life broke apart into silence. But the real transformation happened not in the graveyards but in the fields and workshops. With so many laborers lost, those who survived found their work suddenly in high demand. Peasants who once owed their lives to a lord could now demand wages for their labor. This shift cracked the foundation of feudalism, a system that had kept people bound to the land for generations. Uprisings followed as workers refused to return to old obligations. The manorial system, where a single landlord controlled everything, slowly crumbled away. The economic consequences were just as profound. With fewer people to produce food, prices fell for grain and livestock while wages rose. Land that had been farmed for centuries returned to forest. A new mobility emerged among the workforce, people who could move to towns, learn trades, and build lives independent of noble patronage. This was not simply a recovery, it was a reordering of society. The trauma of the plague also reshaped religious and cultural attitudes. Many questioned why their prayers had gone unanswered. Some turned to intense personal faith, others to skepticism. Art and literature began to focus less on the afterlife and more on the fragility and value of human life. This questioning spirit helped set the stage for the Renaissance, an explosion of creativity and inquiry that would redefine Europe. Yet while disease dismantled old structures through loss, another force was about to redraw whole continents through ambition. Military conquest, fueled by new technologies and old rivalries, would soon create an upheaval just as world-changing. One conquest reshaped the world with terrifying speed. In the early 13th century, a leader named Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe and launched a campaign of expansion that would become the largest contiguous land empire in history. His successors continued the momentum, pushing westward into Persia, the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and eastward into China and Korea. The scale of their advance was unlike anything seen before. Entire cities that resisted were reduced to rubble, and populations that once thrived were scattered or lost. The sacking of Baghdad in the year 1258 stands as one of the most devastating moments of this era. At the time, Baghdad was a center of learning, culture, and commerce, home to scholars, libraries, and advanced irrigation systems that had supported life along the Tigris River for centuries. When the Mongol forces led by Hulagu Khan breached the city, they dismantled much of what had taken generations to build. Canals that watered the surrounding farmland were deliberately destroyed, causing long-term damage to the region's agriculture. The loss of life was staggering, with historians estimating hundreds of thousands of people perished in the siege and its aftermath. The destruction was not limited to Baghdad. Across Eurasia, from the plains of Hungary to the cities of Central Asia, the same pattern repeated, swift and overwhelming force that left survivors in shock and leaders scrambling to adapt. Yet among the ruins, something unexpected emerged. The Mongol Empire unified a vast stretch of territory from the Pacific coast to Eastern Europe, and within that space, trade routes that had been dangerous and fragmented became safer and more reliable. The Silk Road, that ancient network connecting East and West, experienced a golden age under Mongol protection. Goods like silk and spices moved freely, and more importantly, so did ideas. Gunpowder, paper-making, the printing press, and the compass began to travel westward, influencing the technological and cultural development of Europe and the Middle East. But these exchanges came at a terrible price. The methods used to maintain control, the psychological terror that preceded Mongol armies, the swift punishment of any rebellion, and the systematic depopulation of entire regions created a legacy of fear that changed the nature of warfare itself. Armies across the world began to emulate Mongol tactics, prioritizing speed, discipline, and total annihilation of their enemies' resolve. The psychological scars lingered for generations, and the societies that collapsed under the assault were never the same. The Mongol conquests, in their brutal efficiency, demonstrated how quickly the old world could be swept away, leaving a blank canvas for new powers to write their own stories. And as one empire receded, another form of exploitation would soon rise, one that moved not across land but across the ocean, linking continents in a network of forced labor and unimaginable suffering. A commerce in human lives reshaped the modern world. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to labor in the plantations and mines of the Americas. This was not a random occurrence but a vast, systematic enterprise fueled by European colonial powers who saw human beings as a commodity to be bought, sold, and worked to exhaustion. The journey itself, known as the Middle Passage, became a nightmare of confinement and suffering. Men, women, and children were packed into the holds of ships with barely room to move. Disease spread quickly in the cramped and unsanitary conditions, and many did not survive the crossing. Historians estimate that roughly 15% of those captured, nearly 2 million people, died during the voyage. Their bodies were thrown overboard, leaving no trace of their existence but the records of the ships that carried them. The destruction went far beyond the individual lives lost. Entire African societies were torn apart. Coastal kingdoms that once thrived on trade and diplomacy became centers of raiding and conflict as local leaders, sometimes coerced, sometimes complicit, participated in the capture and sale of their own people. Families were shattered, cultural knowledge vanished, and communities that had existed for centuries were depopulated or dissolved. The social fabric of West and Central Africa was irreparably damaged, with some regions losing so many young adults that their economic and political development was thrown off course for generations. The effects of this destabilization can still be felt in the region today. Meanwhile, the wealth generated by slave labor built the foundations of European colonial empires. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee produced by enslaved people in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South flowed into European ports, fueling industries, financing banks, and enriching merchants and plantation owners. Port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes grew prosperous on the profits of the trade. The labor of millions of Africans, extracted through violence and coercion, created the capital that helped finance the Industrial Revolution in England and the expansion of the United States. Economic systems that still influence global trade and inequality were built on this foundation. The consequences also created enduring racial hierarchies that have shaped societies ever since. To justify the inhumanity of the trade, pseudoscientific theories and legal codes were developed that classified people of African descent as inferior, as property rather than human beings. This ideology of racial superiority did not vanish with the abolition of slavery. It persisted in laws, in customs, and in institutions, creating a legacy of discrimination and inequality that continues to affect the lives of millions in the United States and Brazil, two countries that receive the largest numbers of enslaved Africans. The struggle for civil rights, the debates over reparations, and the ongoing conversations about systemic racism are all echoes of this history. It is a moral and humanitarian catastrophe that defies easy summary. The scale of suffering, the destruction of cultures, and the lasting damage to human dignity cannot be measured in numbers alone. The transatlantic slave trade was driven by economic greed, a cold calculation of profit over humanity. But as devastating as it was, another force was about to emerge, one that would industrialize cruelty on an even larger scale, driven not by commerce alone but by a twisted ideology that sought to remake the world through organized violence. One ideology took organized violence to its most terrible extreme. During the 1930s and 40s, the Nazi regime in Germany set out to systematically persecute and destroy entire groups of people based on race, religion, and political belief. The core target was the Jewish population of Europe, a community that had contributed to the continent's culture, science, and daily life for centuries. But the victims also included millions of others: Roma, Slavs, disabled individuals, and those who opposed the regime. What followed was not a single battle or a brief conflict, but a long, calculated process of exclusion, dispossession, and ultimately mass killing. The machinery of this destruction had many parts. Special units followed advancing armies, rounding up civilians and shooting them into mass graves. Then came the camps, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, built not for imprisonment but for efficient, industrial-scale loss of life. In those camps, human beings were treated as numbers, processed through a system that used technology and organization to carry out murder on a scale the world had never seen. Trains delivered people from across Europe, and within hours, many were sent directly to gas chambers. The bodies were then burned in crematoria, reducing individuals to ash and smoke. The logistics were chillingly precise, with schedules, supplies, and personnel coordinated across the Nazi state. It was not the work of a few fanatics alone. Many organizations were involved, from government ministries to railway companies, from pharmaceutical firms to ordinary soldiers and bureaucrats. The complicity spread through society, making the horror possible through thousands of small decisions and large ones. The sheer scale of the loss is almost impossible to comprehend. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were killed, roughly 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Alongside them, millions of others perished in the camps, in ghettos, and in mass shootings. Entire communities that had existed for generations were erased from the map. The world that emerged after World War II was forever changed by this knowledge. When the war ended, the Allied powers faced a question: how to hold individuals responsible for such unprecedented crimes. The answer came in the form of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted not only for war crimes but for a new category called crimes against humanity. This was a revolutionary legal concept, the idea that certain acts are so terrible they offend the conscience of all people, and that leaders cannot hide behind their own laws or orders. The trials set a precedent that shaped international law for decades. They led to the establishment of permanent international courts, and they inspired later efforts to hold accountable those responsible for atrocities in places like Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and Cambodia. The moral weight of the Holocaust also reshaped global human rights discourse. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was in part a direct response to the Nazi philosophy of racial hierarchy and state-sanctioned cruelty. The idea that every person has inherent dignity and equal rights, regardless of race, religion, or nationality, became a cornerstone of modern civilization. But the impact was even deeper for the survivors and for Jewish communities worldwide. The Holocaust fundamentally altered Jewish identity, creating a shared experience of loss and resilience that continues to influence faith, culture, and politics. In the years that followed, the movement for a Jewish homeland gained urgency, leading to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. That nation's existence and its ongoing conflicts are directly tied to the trauma of the Holocaust. For all these reasons, this period remains a stark warning. It shows what can happen when hatred is allowed to grow unchecked, when propaganda dehumanizes entire groups, and when the machinery of the state is turned against its own people with cold efficiency. It is a reminder that civilization is not a given, that it must be actively protected. And as the war drew to a close, the world would soon face another terrifying weapon born from conflict, one that would make destruction possible on an even more unimaginable scale. On 2 August mornings in 1945, the world entered a new age of destruction. The first atomic bomb ever used in war detonated over Hiroshima, instantly turning a bustling city into a smoking ruin. Within seconds, temperatures near the blast center reached several thousand degrees. Buildings that had stood for decades vanished as if they had never existed. The official estimate placed the immediate death toll at over 100,000 people, but that number only begins to tell the story. The second bomb, dropped 3 days later on Nagasaki, killed tens of thousands more in a similar flash of blinding light and crushing heat. The nature of the devastation was unlike anything seen before. Entire city blocks were simply leveled, not by fire or explosives, but by the raw energy of splitting atoms. Survivors, later called hibakusha, emerged from the rubble with severe burns and injuries. In the weeks and months that followed, a new kind of suffering appeared. Radiation poisoning caused symptoms that doctors had never encountered on such a scale. People who had seemed fine began to lose their hair, feel nauseous, and develop internal bleeding. Years later, the same radiation contributed to cancers, leukemia, and birth defects in children born to those who had been exposed. The psychological trauma was equally profound. Many survivors carried guilt for living while others died, and the memory of what they witnessed haunted them for the rest of their lives. The bombings accomplished their immediate military objective. Japan surrendered within days, bringing World War II to a close, but the war's end did not bring peace of mind. Instead, the United States now possessed a weapon that could, in theory, destroy any city on the planet in a single strike. The Soviet Union, suspicious and determined not to fall behind, accelerated its own nuclear program. Within 4 years, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and the nuclear arms race was underway. Both superpowers began building arsenals of thousands of warheads, each one many times more powerful than the bombs used in Japan. This standoff gave rise to a terrifying doctrine known as mutually assured destruction. The logic was simple but chilling. If both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other completely, then neither could launch a first strike without guaranteeing its own annihilation. The theory held that this balance of terror would prevent war. For decades it did, but the price was a constant state of anxiety. School children practiced duck and cover drills. Governments built fallout shelters. The very possibility of human extinction entered public consciousness for the first time in history. The ethical questions raised by the bombings have never been settled. Was it necessary to drop the second bomb so soon after the first? Were civilian populations deliberately targeted to break morale? These debates continue among historians, ethicists, and military strategists. The bombings also set a precedent that cities could be considered legitimate targets in total war, a shift that made non-combatants participants in conflict against their will. The legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just the loss of life, but the permanent change in how nations view warfare. The atomic age introduced a responsibility that previous generations never faced: the power to end human civilization. While nuclear weapons represented a technological leap, the next event involves a global conflict that introduced a different kind of industrialized slaughter, one that ground men into mud across entire continents. A single bullet fired in a crowded street changed the course of the 20th century. On June 28, 1914, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped up to a car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie. Princip fired 2 shots, killing them both within minutes. The act itself was shocking but not unprecedented. European powers had seen political assassinations before. What made this one different was the system of alliances and rivalries that had been tightening across the continent for decades, a web of treaties and secret agreements that turned a local crime into a global catastrophe. The response was swift and rigid. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding concessions that would effectively end Serbian sovereignty. Serbia accepted most terms, but one refusal was enough. A month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Then the alliances kicked in. Russia, bound by treaty to protect Serbia, mobilized its army. Germany, seeing Russia as a threat, declared war on Russia and then on France. When German troops marched through neutral Belgium to reach France, Britain entered the war to honor its commitment to Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, nearly all of Europe was at war. What began as a political crisis in the Balkans became a conflict that would consume the world. The men who marched off that summer expected a short, glorious war. They imagined cavalry charges and decisive battles, a return home by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves in a landscape of mud and wire, where soldiers lived in trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Artillery shells rained down day and night. Machine guns mowed down waves of advancing troops. Poison gas, first used by the Germans in 1915, added a new kind of horror, choking men in their own lungs or blinding them slowly. Soldiers learned to dread the whistle of incoming shells, the smell of mustard gas, and the sight of rats feeding on the dead. By the time the war ended in November 1918, an estimated 16 million people had lost their lives. Among them were 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians caught in the chaos of famine, displacement, and shelling. The scale of destruction was so vast that it reshaped the world. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, crumbled under the strain. New nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia emerged from the ruins. Borders were redrawn across Europe and the Middle East, often with little regard for the people who lived there. The treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles, imposed heavy penalties on Germany, including huge reparations and the loss of territory. Those terms bred deep resentment and economic hardship, creating fertile ground for extremism. In Russia, the war had already triggered a revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power, introducing a new communist ideology that would challenge the capitalist world for the next 70 years. In Italy, economic misery and national pride fueled the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini. And in Germany, a bitter sense of betrayal and humiliation would soon give rise to a dictator whose ambitions would plunge the world into another, even more devastating war. The technology of war had advanced with terrifying speed. Tanks rolled across no man's land, aircraft dropped bombs on cities, submarines stalked merchant ships. By the end of the conflict, war was no longer a matter of professional armies clashing in open fields. It had become an industrial machine designed to destroy entire populations. The assassination of one man had set in motion a chain of events that killed millions, redrew maps, and unleashed ideologies of hatred that would ultimately lead to an even darker chapter. And while that bullet started a war between nations, the next event was a domestic explosion of violence that redefined the meaning of revolution, one that consumed a country from within. The guillotine became the most famous symbol of a revolution that turned on itself. Between 1793 and 1794, a period known as the Reign of Terror, the revolutionary government of France executed more than 16,000 people in the name of protecting the Republic. The king and queen were among the first to fall, but the blade did not stop with royalty. It soon claimed ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, and even former revolutionaries who had once cheered for reform. What began as a struggle for liberty and equality had morphed into a machinery of suspicion and fear. The driving force behind this transformation was the Committee of Public Safety, a small group of leaders who believed that terror was not just acceptable but necessary. They saw danger everywhere, foreign armies at the borders, internal enemies hiding in every street, and spies lurking in every conversation. To save the revolution, they argued, the state must be ruthless. Any dissent, any hesitation, any whisper of criticism could be labeled treason. And treason meant one thing: a trip to the Place de la Révolution where the guillotine stood waiting. The effect on daily life was profound. Neighbors began to inform on neighbors, letters were opened, suspicion grew like a disease. People learned to speak carefully, avoid political topics, and never draw attention to themselves. The revolutionary tribunals that judged the accused operated with little evidence and no appeal. A single accusation could lead to death. In the city of Nantes alone, thousands were executed by drowning when the guillotine could not keep up with the pace of arrests. The ideology that justified all this violence claimed to be building a perfect society, a republic of virtue where citizens would be free and equal. But in practice, virtue meant obedience and freedom meant following the official line. The reign of terror did not last long, about a year before its own architects became victims. The leader of the committee, Maximilien Robespierre, was arrested and executed in July 1794. The people had grown weary of the constant fear, and the revolution itself seemed to be devouring its children. When the bloodshed finally stopped, France was left exhausted and disillusioned. The promise of the revolution had been twisted into a justification for state-sponsored killing. The idea that terror could be a legitimate tool of government was deeply damaging. It discredited radical democracy for generations, both in France and around the world. Observers in other nations looked at the chaos and fear, and many concluded that too much freedom too quickly could lead to tyranny of a different kind. The legacy of the Reign of Terror is a cautionary tale about idealism without limits. It shows how easily noble words can be used to justify cruelty, and how quickly a society can lose its moral compass when fear replaces trust. The French Revolution did not end with the terror, but the memory of those months haunted every democratic movement that followed. It also foreshadowed something even darker. When ideological extremism is combined with modern organization and national ambition, the result can be far more systematic and far more deadly. And that next step was already taking shape across Europe, where a new kind of political violence was about to be industrialized on a scale the world had never seen. The Russian Revolution began with a desperate winter and ended with a new kind of state built on violence. In February of 1917, food shortages and collapsing morale in the midst of World War I drove crowds into the streets of Petrograd. Soldiers refused to fire on protesters. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government took over, but it made a fatal mistake: it continued the war. By October, the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, saw their chance. They seized key points in the capital with shocking speed, arresting ministers and declaring a new government of workers and peasants. The world's first communist state was born, but its birth was anything but peaceful. The Bolsheviks faced immediate opposition from former Tsarist officers, landowners, and foreign armies who wanted to crush the revolution. A brutal civil war erupted that would last until 1922. During that conflict, the Bolsheviks turned to a policy they called the Red Terror, a systematic campaign of repression designed to eliminate any threat to their power. The targets were broad and ill-defined. Political opponents, including other socialist groups who disagreed with Lenin's tactics, were arrested and executed in large numbers. Clergy who refused to surrender church property faced the same fate. ordinary civilians suspected of hoarding food or sympathizing with the enemy were rounded up and shot without trial. The Cheka, the secret police force, operated with almost no legal restraints. They set up tribunals that delivered swift judgments, often death. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of people were executed during the Red Terror. The violence was not limited to bullets. The Bolsheviks also began building a network of detention camps, the precursor to the Gulag system. These camps held captured soldiers, political prisoners, and anyone deemed a class enemy. Conditions were harsh, with inadequate food, brutal labor, and disease spreading through crowded barracks. Many did not survive. The purpose was not just punishment, but the elimination of entire social classes that the regime saw as obstacles to a new society. One of the most striking episodes of this period was the Kronstadt Rebellion in March of 1921. The sailors at the Kronstadt naval base had been among the Bolsheviks' most loyal supporters during the revolution. But by 1921, they grew disillusioned with the growing dictatorship and demanded free elections, freedom of speech, and an end to the one-party system. Lenin responded by ordering the Red Army to crush them. Thousands of sailors were killed in the assault, and survivors were executed or sent to camps afterward. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated, even from former allies. When the civil war ended, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, but the country lay in ruins. Industry had collapsed, agriculture was devastated, and millions had died from combat, famine, and disease. The new government, now called the Soviet Union, solidified its one-party rule. There would be no elections, no opposition, no free press. The Communist Party held absolute control over every aspect of life. In the years that followed, the regime launched a campaign of rapid industrialization under Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans. Cities rose from empty fields, factories churned out steel and machinery, and the country transformed from a peasant society into an industrial power. But the cost was staggering. Millions of peasants were forced onto collective farms, and those who resisted were deported or executed. Famine struck in Ukraine and other regions, killing millions more. The Gulag system expanded into a vast network of labor camps that held millions of prisoners throughout the Stalin era. The legacy of the Russian Revolution was twofold. It created a model of state socialism that would inspire movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It also introduced a blueprint for totalitarian control that would be studied and replicated by other regimes. The ideological divide between the Soviet Union and the capitalist democracies deepened into the Cold War, a confrontation that shaped international relations for nearly half a century. Armies were built, proxy wars fought, and the world divided into two hostile camps, each believing its system was the only path forward. The violence that accompanied the revolution was not a temporary aberration but a foundational element of the state itself. The Bolsheviks believed that constructing a perfect society required destroying the old one completely, even if that meant sacrificing a generation. That belief led to suffering on an unimaginable scale and left a scar on the human conscience that has never fully healed. And while this revolution split the world along ideological lines, a different kind of upheaval was about to redraw a subcontinent along lines of faith. A single line drawn on a map tore a subcontinent apart. In August of 1947, British India was carved into two independent nations, India and Pakistan, a division meant to separate Hindu and Muslim majority regions. But the line, known as the Radcliffe Line, was drawn in just 5 weeks by a British lawyer who had never visited India. He used outdated maps and population data, and the result was chaos. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible border. Families were split, villages divided, and millions of people realized they were now living in the wrong country. What followed was one of the largest and most tragic mass migrations in human history. An estimated 15 million people packed their belongings onto trains, into carts, or onto their own backs and walked hundreds of miles toward what they hoped would be safety. Hindus and Sikhs moved east from what was now Pakistan into India. Muslims moved west from India into Pakistan. The roads and railway tracks became rivers of humanity, with the elderly, the sick, and the young struggling to keep up in the blistering summer heat. The migration was not orderly or peaceful. As these columns of desperate people moved, they became targets. Religious tensions that had simmered for decades exploded into widespread communal conflict. Gangs attacked the migrating caravans, trains were stopped and their passengers killed, and entire villages were set ablaze. The violence was brutal and indiscriminate, leaving deep emotional scars on survivors. Historians estimate that between 1 and 2 million people lost their lives during those chaotic months. Countless others experienced the loss of homes, livelihoods, and loved ones, often witnessing scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Women and children were especially vulnerable, facing unspeakable hardship. The trauma of that period became embedded in the collective memory of both nations, passed down through families as a story of survival but also of profound loss. The partition did more than create two new countries. It sowed the seeds of a lasting and bitter rivalry. The border itself was never properly settled, and the region of Kashmir, a princely state with a Muslim majority but a Hindu ruler, became a flashpoint. Both India and Pakistan claimed it, leading to the first of several wars in 1947. That dispute remains unresolved to this day, fueling military standoffs and proxy conflicts. The enmity between the two nuclear-armed neighbors has shaped the geopolitics of South Asia for over 70 years, with both nations spending heavily on defense and engaging in periodic confrontations that threaten to escalate into a wider war. The psychological legacy of partition is just as enduring. In India and Pakistan, the stories of that time are raw and personal, passed through generations. They shape how people view the other side, often with suspicion or hostility. The trauma is not just historical, it is a living force that influences politics, identity, and even popular culture. Many families still do not know what happened to relatives who disappeared in the chaos. The annual observance of partition continues to evoke deep emotion. And yet, for all its devastation, partition was a political decision driven by the pressures of decolonization and the urgency to withdraw British rule. It was a failed attempt to solve a complex problem with a simple line on a map. The next event, however, was not a miscalculation or a rushed plan. It was a deliberate, systematic effort to eliminate an entire group of people, a genocide that unfolded in plain sight and shocked the world into a new understanding of evil. In just 100 days, a nation tore itself apart with a speed that defied belief. The year was 1994, and the small Central African country of Rwanda became the scene of an organized campaign of extreme violence. The targets were the Tutsi people, a minority ethnic group, along with moderate Hutu who refused to join the extremists. By the time the violence ended, an estimated 800,000 men, women, and children had lost their lives. What made this event so disturbing was not just the scale but the method. The weapons used were often basic machetes, clubs, and farm tools, placed in the hands of ordinary citizens who were urged to kill their neighbors. The killing was personal, intimate, and relentless. Hate radio stations played a central role in fueling the violence. Broadcasters called for the elimination of the Tutsi population, referring to them as cockroaches and urging listeners to hunt them down. The radio became a weapon of psychological manipulation, spreading fear and hatred into homes across the country. It transformed friends into enemies and turned communities into battlegrounds. The international community, meanwhile, chose to stay away. A small United Nations peacekeeping force was present, but after the deaths of 10 Belgian soldiers, the Security Council voted to reduce its size rather than reinforce it. The world's major powers, still haunted by the memory of Somalia a year earlier, had no appetite for another African intervention. The United States, in particular, refused to call the violence a genocide, a legal term that would have obligated action under international treaty. So the killing continued day after day while cameras captured images of bodies floating down rivers and diplomats debated semantics. The roots of this horror ran deep. Colonial Belgium had governed Rwanda for decades, and during that time it had created rigid ethnic categories. It issued identity cards labeling people as Hutu or Tutsi, and it favored the Tutsi minority for positions of power. This policy sowed resentment among the Hutu majority. After independence in 1962, power shifted to the Hutu elite, who began to discriminate against Tutsi and occasionally carried out violent purges. By the early 1990s, a civil war between the government and a Tutsi rebel group, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, had created a tense standoff. Extremist Hutu leaders, fearing a loss of power, planned a final solution: the total elimination of the Tutsi population. When the president's plane was shot down on April 6, 1994, they used the event as a signal to begin the killings. The genocide ended only when the Rwandan Patriotic Front captured the capital, Kigali, in July of that year. The aftermath was chaotic. More than 2 million Hutu, including many who had taken part in the violence, fled into neighboring Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. This refugee crisis destabilized the entire region, leading to years of conflict and further loss of life. In Rwanda itself, the new government faced an impossible task: rebuilding a shattered nation where neighbors had killed neighbors. The international community, ashamed by its inaction, responded by establishing the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. This court was set up in Arusha, Tanzania, to prosecute the masterminds of the genocide. It was the first time an international body had been created specifically to punish the crime of genocide since the Nuremberg trials. The tribunal handed down sentences for many of the top leaders, establishing important legal precedents. It also reinforced the idea that national sovereignty could not shield individuals from accountability for crimes against humanity. The Rwandan genocide changed the way the world thought about intervention. The failure to act led to a new principle in international affairs: the responsibility to protect, or R2P. This concept holds that when a state fails to protect its own people from mass atrocities, the international community has a duty to step in. While the principle remains controversial and unevenly applied, it represents a shift in moral expectations. The memory of Rwanda, 100 days of killing while the world watched, continues to haunt the conscience of global leaders. Yet, even as Rwanda struggled to heal and rebuild, a different genocide was unfolding in Southeast Asia, one that was equally systematic but carried out in secrecy, hidden from the eyes of the world. In Cambodia, a secret war was being waged against its own people. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime, led by a man known as Pol Pot, set out to build an agrarian utopia by erasing everything that had come before. They called it Year Zero, a complete reset of society. Money was abolished, schools were closed, religion was banned, cities were emptied, and millions of people were forced into the countryside to work on collective farms. The goal was to create a pure, classless society of peasants, but the reality was a nightmare of starvation, exhaustion, and systematic violence. Intellectuals, doctors, teachers, and anyone with an education were seen as threats. They were rounded up and sent to special detention centers, where many were subjected to harsh interrogation and execution. Even wearing glasses or speaking a foreign language could mark someone for elimination. The regime controlled every aspect of daily life. Families were separated, children were taken from parents and indoctrinated in labor camps. Meals were reduced to tiny portions of watery rice porridge, and illness spread rapidly without medicine or sanitation. People worked 16-hour days in the fields, sleeping in communal huts with no privacy. anyone who complained or failed to meet production quotas was labeled an enemy and disappeared. Historians estimate that approximately 1.7 million Cambodians lost their lives during those 4 years, roughly 1/4 of the country's population. The scale of the loss was a demographic catastrophe that hollowed out an entire generation. Families were shattered, and the cultural fabric of Cambodia, its music, its art, its Buddhist traditions, was torn apart. The regime destroyed temples, burned books, and murdered monks. The past was not just forgotten, it was actively erased. The suffering only ended in 1979, when neighboring Vietnam, itself a communist nation but wary of the Khmer Rouge's instability, invaded and toppled the regime. Pol Pot and his top leaders fled to the jungle, where they continued to lead a resistance movement for years, but the damage was done. The country lay in ruins, its people traumatized, its land littered with mass graves that would later be discovered by survivors and researchers. In the years that followed, Cambodia struggled to rebuild. A tribunal was established with help from the United Nations to prosecute the surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge for crimes against humanity. The proceedings were slow and often controversial, but they represented a small step toward accountability for the millions who had suffered. The psychological scars, however, remained deep. In Cambodian culture, the memory of those years is often passed down in silence. Many survivors still carry the weight of what they witnessed, and the country's development was set back by decades. This radical experiment in communism, born from a desire to create a perfect society, became one of the deadliest of the 20th century. It serves as a stark reminder that ideology without humanity can turn a nation into a prison. As Cambodia began its long journey of healing, another wartime tragedy was unfolding on the other side of Asia, one that would reveal the depths of cruelty in a different conflict. For 6 weeks starting in December 1937, the Chinese city of Nanjing endured an ordeal that shocked the world. Japanese forces had captured the capital of the Republic of China after a furious battle, and what followed was a systematic campaign of violence against the civilian population. Over the course of that bitter winter, soldiers carried out widespread killings, looting, and attacks on women and children. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed prisoners lost their lives. The brutality was not hidden. Foreign missionaries and journalists who remained in the city documented what they saw, sending reports and photographs to the outside world. Their accounts created a wave of international outrage, but the war continued, and the full scale of the tragedy would not be fully understood for decades. The Nanjing Massacre, as it came to be known, left deep and lasting scars. For China, it became a central symbol of the suffering endured during the Japanese invasion, a memory passed down through families and taught in schools as a warning against foreign aggression. It reinforced a narrative of victimhood that shaped Chinese national identity and fueled resentment toward Japan that lasted long after the war ended. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were strained for generations. Even when economic ties grew strong in later years, the memory of that winter remained a barrier to full reconciliation. Yet the event also became the subject of fierce historical dispute. Some Japanese nationalists and revisionist historians have questioned the scale of the killings, arguing that the numbers were exaggerated or that the events were a product of wartime propaganda. These claims have sparked heated debates both within Japan and internationally. For many in China, any attempt to minimize the massacre is seen as an insult to the memory of the victims and a refusal to confront the past. The controversy continues to fuel nationalist narratives on both sides, making the Nanjing Massacre not just a historical event but an ongoing political and emotional battleground. When the war ended, several Japanese military leaders were tried and executed for their roles in the massacre, but for many survivors and their descendants, justice never felt complete. The wounds from those 6 weeks remain raw, a reminder of how quickly civilization can collapse into organized cruelty. and as the world processed the horror of what happened in Nanjing, an even earlier genocide, one that preceded the Second World War and remains fiercely contested to this day, had already set a terrifying precedent for how states could turn against their own people. That earlier genocide began in the final years of the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, the empire's leaders became increasingly suspicious of the Armenian population, a Christian minority living primarily in the eastern provinces. Fearing that Armenians might side with the Russian enemy, the Ottoman government made a fateful decision. They would deport the entire Armenian community from their ancestral homeland. In the spring of 1915, the process began with chilling efficiency. Armenian intellectuals, community leaders, and professionals were arrested in Constantinople and other major cities. Most were executed within days. Then came the order for the general population to leave their homes. Families were given a few hours to gather their belongings. They were told they were being relocated to safer areas, but the real destination was something far worse. The deportees were formed into columns and forced to march south toward the Syrian desert. These were not simple journeys. The routes were chosen to pass through the most inhospitable terrain, and the marchers received little food, water, or medical care. Thousands collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, and illness along the way. Others were attacked by local militias or by bands of criminals who saw the columns as easy targets. The weakest, the elderly, the sick, and the very young were often left behind to perish. The final destination for many was the desert around Deir ez-Zor, a place with no shelter, no water, and no hope. Those who survived the march faced slow death from starvation and exposure. The entire operation was a systematic dismantling of a culture that had thrived in Anatolia for more than 2,000 years. Ancient churches were destroyed or converted into mosques. Armenian place names were erased from maps. The community's economic and social institutions were dissolved. Among those forced from their homes were some of the empire's most skilled artisans, merchants, and farmers, a loss that would permanently alter the region's character. By the time the violence subsided, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians had lost their lives. The demographic map of Anatolia was redrawn entirely. A region that had once been home to a vibrant Armenian civilization became, within a few years, almost completely emptied of its Armenian population. For the survivors who made it to safety in Syria, Lebanon, France, or the United States, the trauma of that period became the defining experience of their identity, passed down through generations as a story of both loss and resilience. The international response at the time was mixed. Some governments issued condemnations, but no meaningful intervention occurred. The pattern was set. A state could commit mass atrocities against its own citizens with little fear of outside consequences. That impunity would echo through the 20th century, from the Holocaust to Cambodia to Rwanda. The legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, who later coined the word genocide, was deeply influenced by the Armenian experience. He saw that the term massacre was insufficient to describe what had happened, because the goal was not just to kill people but to destroy an entire people's existence. His work on this concept eventually shaped the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948. Yet for all its influence on international law, the Armenian genocide remains a deeply contested event. The Republic of Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, has consistently denied that the killings were systematic or intentional. Turkish officials argue that the deaths were a tragic consequence of war and that the number of victims has been exaggerated. This denial has become a cornerstone of Turkish national identity and a major obstacle in relations with Armenia and with Western nations that recognize the genocide. For Armenians around the world, the struggle for recognition is not just about history. It is about dignity, justice, and the hope that acknowledging the past can prevent future horrors. The Armenian diaspora, spread across dozens of countries, has made this cause a central part of its identity, lobbying governments and raising public awareness for over a century. The political impact of the genocide extends far beyond the Armenian community. It set a precedent that states could act with impunity against their own populations, a lesson that was not lost on later regimes. It also demonstrated the power of denial as a political tool, allowing perpetrators and their successors to avoid accountability by controlling the historical narrative. Anatolia was forever changed, its diversity replaced by a homogeneity that the empire's architects had intended. The Armenians who once lived there were gone, but their memory persists in the stories of survivors, in the scattered churches that still stand, and in the ongoing debate over what happened and what it means. The world has still not settled that debate, and the denial itself has become a second wound for the descendants of the victims. While this genocide was state-organized and finite in its execution, targeting a specific population during a specific war, the next event would take a different shape entirely, one that was not a single campaign but a long-running institution of terror that haunted an entire nation for decades. The Spanish Inquisition operated for over 3 centuries, and its name still carries a chilling weight. Established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, its official mission was to maintain religious orthodoxy within their growing kingdom. But the real target was not the general population. It was aimed at conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, and Moriscos, Muslims who had done the same. The crown suspected that many of these converts were secretly practicing their old faith, and they saw this as a threat to the unity of Spain. So they created a tribunal with extraordinary powers, a religious court that answered directly to the monarchy, not to the Pope in Rome. What followed was a systematic campaign of surveillance, accusation, and punishment that would reshape Spanish society for generations. The methods of the Inquisition were designed to inspire terror. Accusations could come from anyone, a jealous neighbor, a disgruntled employee, even a family member. The accused were taken to secret prisons where they were held without knowing who had testified against them. The trials were closed to the public, and the accused had no right to face their accusers or to have a lawyer present. Confession was the goal, and to obtain it, the inquisitors used a range of techniques including prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, and physical torture. The torture was carefully regulated, at least on paper. It could only be applied once, and it was not supposed to cause permanent injury or death. But in practice, the rules were often bent. Victims were stretched on the rack, burned with hot irons, or subjected to the water cure, a method where water was forced into the mouth and nose to simulate drowning. The pain was immense, and many confessed to anything the inquisitors wanted to hear. Once a confession was obtained, the next step was the auto da fe, a public ceremony that was part religious ritual, part spectacle. On a designated day, prisoners were paraded through the streets wearing pointed hats and yellow robes marked with symbols of their shame. They were led to a public square where a large platform had been erected. There, before crowds of onlookers, the sentences were read aloud. Some prisoners were sentenced to wear the shameful garments for a period of time, others to long prison terms or service in the galleys. But for those deemed unrepentant, the punishment was death by burning. The executions were carried out by the civil authorities, not the church, a legal fiction that allowed the Inquisition to claim it did not shed blood. But the flames were real, and the smell of burning flesh filled the square as the crowd watched. Historians estimate that over the Inquisition's long history, tens of thousands of people were tried and punished. Several thousand were executed. The exact numbers are debated, but the impact is not. The Inquisition created a culture of fear that permeated every level of Spanish society. People learned to watch what they said, what they ate, even what they wore. Any deviation from expected behavior could be reported. Intellectual life suffered enormously. Scholars and writers avoided controversial topics, and Spain's universities, once among the finest in Europe, began to decline. The printing press, which had spread new ideas across the continent, was tightly controlled. Books were censored and foreign works were banned. Spain, which had been a crossroads of three cultures, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, became increasingly isolated and homogeneous. The immediate consequences were dramatic. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, the Alhambra Decree ordered the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert. An estimated 200,000 Jews left Spain, taking with them their skills, their capital, and their commercial networks. The loss was a severe blow to the Spanish economy and to the intellectual vitality of the kingdom. Later, the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted, were also expelled in the early 17th century, further draining the population and the economy. The Inquisition also served to centralize royal power. By controlling religious orthodoxy, the monarchy weakened the nobility and the local authorities who might have challenged its rule. The Inquisition became a tool of state, a way to enforce not just religious conformity but political obedience. Its reach extended to Spanish colonies in the Americas, where it was used to control the indigenous population and to suppress any challenge to colonial authority. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition is a disturbing one. It became a model for later religious and political persecutions across Europe and beyond. The idea that a state could use secret trials, torture, and public punishment to enforce ideological conformity was a precedent that would be repeated in various forms. The Inquisition's suppression of intellectual freedom helped create a climate where new ideas were feared rather than embraced, contributing to Spain's long decline as a European power. And the culture of fear it cultivated left deep psychological scars that lasted for centuries. Even today, the word Inquisition evokes a sense of relentless, unaccountable questioning, a system where the accused is presumed guilty and the truth is whatever the authorities decide. The Spanish Inquisition was not an anomaly of history. It was a carefully constructed institution that revealed how easily faith can be twisted into a weapon of control. As we move forward, we will see how another kind of control, driven not by religion but by conquest and commerce, would lead to a demographic catastrophe of even greater proportions. When Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519, he carried more than swords and gunpowder. The forces he unleashed would topple one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas within 2 years. The Aztec Empire, centered on the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, had ruled central Mexico for nearly a century. Its capital dazzled visitors with its grand temples, bustling markets, and intricate canals. But that world was about to be crushed under the weight of European ambition, disease, and a brutal siege that left the city in ruins. Cortés arrived with only about 500 Spanish soldiers, but he quickly discovered that the Aztecs had enemies. The empire had conquered many neighboring groups, forcing them to pay tribute and provide victims for religious ceremonies. Cortés turned this resentment into alliances. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors who had fought the Aztecs for generations joined his campaign. They saw the Spanish as a chance to break free from Aztec domination. What they did not foresee was that their new allies would bring destruction far beyond what they imagined. The march toward Tenochtitlan was not a simple invasion. It was a collision of worlds. The Spanish brought horses, steel armor, and firearms, technologies unknown in the Americas. They also brought something invisible but far deadlier, diseases like smallpox and measles. The indigenous population had no immunity to these European illnesses. Outbreaks swept through communities long before the Spanish arrived, killing tens of thousands and weakening the empire from within. When Cortés and his forces finally reached Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, the city still stood proud. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II received them cautiously, unsure whether Cortés was a mortal enemy or something from prophecy. The Spanish were given lodging in the city, but tensions quickly rose. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage, hoping to control the empire through him. For months, an uneasy peace held. Then violence erupted during a festival. Spanish soldiers, fearing an uprising, attacked unarmed Aztec nobles and priests in the main temple. The massacre sparked a furious rebellion. Moctezuma was killed in the chaos, and the Spanish were forced to flee the city on a night of desperate fighting that became known as the Noche Triste, or Sad Night. Hundreds of Spanish and thousands of their allies died as they fought their way across the causeways. Weighed down by gold they had looted, Cortés regrouped and planned his revenge. For months, he and his allies built a fleet of small boats to blockade the island city. They cut off the aqueducts that supplied fresh water. They burned crops and destroyed nearby villages that had once provided food. By the time the final siege began in May of 1521, Tenochtitlan was isolated and starving. Smallpox had already swept through the city, killing thousands, including the new emperor Cuitlahuac. The defenders fought with desperate courage, using spears, arrows, and stones against Spanish steel and cannon fire. But they had no answer for the disease that weakened them daily. The siege lasted 80 days. When the city finally fell on August 13, 1521, the scene was one of utter devastation. The streets were lined with bodies. The canals ran red, the great temples were pulled down, and the stones were used to build a Spanish cathedral on the same spot. The Spanish and their allies proceeded to systematically dismantle everything that had made Tenochtitlan a wonder of the world. What followed was not just a military conquest but a cultural erasure. The Spanish banned indigenous religions, destroyed statues of Aztec gods, and burned thousands of pictographic books that recorded history, astronomy, and law. Only a handful of these codices survive today. The old gods were replaced by a single Christian deity, and the old calendar gave way to European time. The Aztec education system, which had produced scholars and astronomers, was dismantled. The language of the ruling class, Nahuatl, was suppressed in official matters, though it survived in everyday speech. The destruction of knowledge was staggering. A civilization that had built floating gardens, developed a complex writing system, and mapped the stars was reduced to a conquered people whose past was treated as something to be erased. With the fall of the empire came a new system of labor and land ownership called the encomienda. Under this arrangement, Spanish colonists were granted control over indigenous villages. In theory, the encomienda was meant to protect and Christianize the native people. In practice, it became a form of forced labor. Indigenous men, women, and children were compelled to work in mines, on plantations, and in construction projects. The conditions were brutal. Many died from overwork, malnutrition, or the diseases that continued to spread. The population of central Mexico, which had been roughly 25 million before the conquest, plummeted to less than 2 million within a century. The encomienda system created a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the Spanish-born peninsulares, followed by those born in the colonies, the criollos. Below them came the mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, and at the very bottom were the indigenous majority and the small number of African slaves brought in later years. This racial caste system would define Latin American society for centuries, shaping everything from economic opportunity to political power. The institutionalized racism that grew out of the conquest left deep scars that still affect the region today. But the conquest also created something new. Over time, the mixing of Spanish and indigenous cultures gave birth to a unique mestizo identity. Language, food, music, and religion blended in ways that produced a rich and complex culture. The Virgin of Guadalupe, a dark-skinned vision of Mary that appeared to an indigenous convert, became a powerful symbol of this fusion, yet the blending was never equal. It happened on terms dictated by the colonizers, and the indigenous heritage was often treated as something to be overcome or hidden. The long-term consequences of the conquest reshaped global power dynamics. The wealth flowing from the silver mines of Mexico and Peru funded the Spanish Empire, making it the dominant power in Europe for over a century. the introduction of American crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes transformed diets across the world. The decimation of the indigenous population opened the door for the massive importation of African slaves, creating the foundation for the plantation economies of the Caribbean and Brazil. The pattern established in Mexico would be repeated across the Americas: disease, military conquest, forced labor, and cultural erasure. Each new encounter with European colonists followed a similar tragic script. And in the northern part of the continent, a different kind of colonial encounter was about to unfold, one that would begin with friendship and trade but end in a similar pattern of displacement and loss. In the southeastern United States, a different kind of removal was taking shape. For decades, 5 sovereign Native American nations, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, had built thriving communities in the lands they had called home for centuries. They had adopted many aspects of European American culture. They owned farms, operated businesses, published newspapers, and established schools. Some even owned enslaved people, a tragic irony that reflected how deeply they had integrated into the economic structures of the region. They were called the 5 civilized tribes by outsiders, a label that reflected the paternalistic attitude of the time, as if their way of life needed approval from the very people who would soon take everything from them. The pressure to remove these nations had been building for years. White settlers, hungry for fertile cotton land, pushed westward into Cherokee and Creek territories. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia in 1829, and the rush was on. State governments passed laws that abolished tribal governments and declared native people subject to state authority. The Cherokee Nation took its case to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1832 the court ruled in their favor, stating that Georgia had no jurisdiction over Cherokee land. President Andrew Jackson reportedly responded with a remark attributed to him: "The Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it." The federal government, which had the power to protect the tribes, chose instead to side with the settlers. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave the president authority to negotiate treaties that would exchange native lands in the southeast for territory west of the Mississippi River. The land in question, present-day Oklahoma, was already occupied by other native peoples, but that fact was conveniently ignored. The treaties that followed were often signed by small factions who did not represent the will of their nations. When those nations refused to leave, the government turned to force. The first to go were the Choctaw in 1831. They were marched westward in the middle of winter with little food, inadequate clothing, and no medical care. The journey was a nightmare of exposure, hunger, and illness. Hundreds died before reaching their destination. The survivors arrived in a land that was unfamiliar, arid, and already contested by other tribes. The Creek followed in 1836, forced out after a brief armed conflict. The Chickasaw negotiated slightly better terms and managed their removal with more organization, but they still lost thousands to disease and hardship along the way. The Seminole of Florida resisted fiercely, fighting a long and costly war that lasted over a decade. Many were captured and sent west, but others escaped into the swamps and remained, the only one of the 5 nations to maintain a continuous presence in its ancestral homeland. The Cherokee removal, which took place in the winter of 1838 to 1839, became the most famous and the most heartbreaking. After years of legal battles and delay, the federal government sent 7,000 soldiers to round up the Cherokee people at gunpoint. Families were pulled from their homes with only what they could carry. Their farms, livestock, and possessions were seized or destroyed. They were herded into internment camps where they waited for months in squalid conditions. Disease swept through the camps and hundreds died before the journey even began. Then came the march. About 16,000 Cherokee were forced to walk over 800 miles through snow, rain, and freezing temperatures. The route, which became known as the Trail of Tears, was a ribbon of suffering stretching across several states. the elderly and the very young were hit hardest. There were not enough wagons for everyone, so most walked. Food rations were meager, often rotten or infested. Clean water was scarce. Pneumonia, whooping cough, and measles spread through the columns. When someone died, they were buried in a shallow grave by the side of the road, and the march continued. By the time the survivors reached Indian territory, an estimated 4,000 Cherokee had lost their lives. When combined with the losses of the other 4 nations, the death toll across all the removals reached into the tens of thousands. The removal was justified through a doctrine that had become popular at the time, an idea that would later be known as manifest destiny. This was the belief that white European Americans were destined by Providence to expand across the entire continent. It was a powerful and convenient ideology that turned a land grab into a sacred mission. The native peoples who stood in the way were portrayed as obstacles to progress, as savages who needed to be removed or civilized. Racist stereotypes were used to dehumanize entire nations, making it easier for the public to accept their suffering. Even those who sympathized often believed that removal was inevitable, that the tide of settlement could not be stopped. The creation of the reservation system was another consequence of this policy. The lands in Oklahoma, designated as Indian Territory, were supposed to be a permanent home for displaced nations, a place where they could govern themselves without interference. But as white settlement continued to expand, those boundaries were repeatedly redrawn and reduced. Treaties were broken as soon as they became inconvenient. The reservations that remained became islands of poverty and isolation, where traditional ways of life were systematically dismantled by government policies aimed at assimilation. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their customs. The trauma of this loss did not fade with time. It was passed down through generations, creating a legacy of poverty, social dislocation, and health challenges that Native American communities still face today. The Trail of Tears was not an accident of history, nor was it the result of a few bad actors. It was a deliberate policy carried out by the United States government with the full force of its military and legal system. It fundamentally transformed the ethnic and political landscape of North America. The Southeast, which had been home to complex and vibrant native civilizations for thousands of years, was emptied and repopulated by settlers who would build a new society on the foundations of what had been taken. That society would go on to become a global power, but its origins in this act of dispossession remain a thread that runs through its entire story. The land that was stolen became the basis for immense wealth, and that wealth shaped the nation's destiny. While the Trail of Tears was a calculated act of human cruelty driven by greed and ideology, the next event would be something entirely different, a force of nature that struck without warning and reshaped the course of European history in a single day. A single night of fire changed the course of an empire. In July of the year 64, a blaze erupted in the merchant shops near the Circus Maximus in Rome. Fanned by strong winds, the flames spread with terrifying speed through the narrow, winding streets lined with wooden buildings. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire consumed everything in its path. When it finally burned out, 10 of Rome's 14 districts lay in smoldering ruins. Thousands of people lost their homes, their livelihoods, and in many cases their lives. The city that had stood as the heart of the Mediterranean world was reduced to ash and rubble. In the immediate aftermath, the Emperor Nero faced a furious public. Rumors began to spread that he had ordered the fire himself, perhaps to clear land for a grand new palace he dreamed of building. Some claimed he had watched the flames from a tower while singing about the fall of Troy, a story that would cling to his name for centuries. Whether Nero actually started the fire remains one of history's great unanswered questions. Many scholars today believe the fire was an accident, a tragic consequence of a crowded city built mostly of timber. But in the moment, Nero needed someone to blame. So he turned his attention to a small and relatively unknown religious group that had been growing quietly in the shadows of the empire, the followers of a recently executed Jewish teacher named Jesus. The persecution that followed was swift and brutal. Christians were rounded up and accused of arson and hatred of humanity. They were subjected to punishments designed to serve as public entertainment. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were burned alive to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later, described the scene with horror, noting that even though the Christians were guilty of antisocial beliefs, they were being destroyed not for the public good but to satisfy one man's cruelty. The executions did not stop the rumors about Nero. Instead, they created a lasting symbol of imperial corruption. The emperor had used innocent people as scapegoats to deflect blame, and the memory of that injustice would stain his legacy forever. In the fire's aftermath, Nero seized a vast area of the ruined city to build his golden house, a sprawling palace complex with gilded ceilings, landscaped gardens, and an artificial lake. The project consumed resources that might have gone to rebuilding homes for the displaced. Public opinion, already shaken by the disaster, hardened into resentment. The political structure of Rome had also been altered. The fire allowed Nero to impose new building codes requiring wider streets and fire-resistant materials, but these reforms came at the cost of further centralizing power in the emperor's hands. For the early Christian community, the fire marked a turning point. The persecution under Nero was the first state-sanctioned attack on the church, and it set a precedent for later waves of oppression under emperors like Domitian and Diocletian. Yet the faith did not die. Instead, the memory of those who suffered became a source of strength. Stories of martyrs who refused to renounce their beliefs spread through the empire, inspiring others to join the movement. The blood of the first victims, as later Christian writers would say, became the seed of the church. The Great Fire of Rome destroyed a city, but it also exposed the fragile nature of imperial authority. A disaster that could have brought the people together instead revealed the depths of a ruler's selfishness and the ease with which a government could turn on its own subjects. And while the flames of Rome eventually died down, another fire of a different kind was about to sweep through a distant land, one that would alter the population of an entire continent and leave a silence that lasted for more than 1,000 years. The walls of Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years, a fortress that had withstood siege after siege. But in the spring of 1453, a new kind of army arrived beneath those walls, one led by a young sultan with a single ambition. Mehmed II was only 21 years old, but he had spent years preparing for this moment. He had built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus to control the strait. He had assembled a fleet of ships and hired engineers to cast the largest cannon the world had ever seen. That cannon, known as the Basilica, could hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton. Its roar was heard miles away, and each shot sent tremors through the ancient defenses. For 54 days, the Ottoman army pounded the walls day and night, while defenders inside the city fought desperately to repair the breaches. The Byzantine Empire had been shrinking for centuries, reduced to little more than the city itself and a few outlying territories. Its population, once hundreds of thousands, had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls. They knew that if Constantinople fell, the empire was over, but they also knew something else. For generations, the city had been a symbol of Christian civilization, a golden bastion that held back the tide of Islam from the east. The Emperor Constantine XI led the defense personally, fighting alongside his soldiers. On the night of May 28th, the city held its breath. The next morning, the final assault began. Ottoman troops poured through a small gate that had been left unlocked, a fatal oversight. Within hours, the city was overwhelmed. What followed was a sack that lasted 3 days. Soldiers looted homes, churches, and palaces. Thousands of civilians were killed in the chaos, and thousands more were taken captive and sold into slavery. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome that had inspired awe for nearly 1,000 years, was stripped of its Christian icons and turned into a mosque. The conquering sultan walked through its doors, bent down and scooped up a handful of dirt, a sign of humility before God. Then he ordered the building to be purified for Islamic worship. The cross that had crowned the dome was removed and a crescent took its place. The transformation was not just physical, it was symbolic. A city that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity became the capital of an expanding Muslim empire. For the Christian world, the news was a shock that rippled across Europe. Kings and popes had long known that Constantinople was in danger, but they had failed to send meaningful help. Theological disputes between the Latin and Greek churches had prevented a united defense. Now that division had cost them the city. The loss disturbed the entire European conscience. It felt like the end of an era, and in many ways it was. The Byzantine Empire, which had preserved the learning of ancient Greece and Rome for over a millennium, was gone. Its scholars, fearing Ottoman rule, gathered their manuscripts and fled westward, carrying with them texts by Plato, Aristotle, and the great philosophers of antiquity. Many settled in Italian cities like Florence and Venice, where they taught Greek language and philosophy to a new generation. Their arrival fueled the Renaissance, the great flowering of art, science, and humanism that was already beginning in Italy. Copies of ancient works that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries were translated and studied. The intellectual energy that followed helped break the hold of medieval scholasticism and opened the door to the modern world. But the fall of Constantinople also had a darker consequence for Europe. The trade routes that had brought spices, silk, and luxury goods from the east through the city were now controlled by the Ottoman Empire. European merchants faced higher taxes and greater restrictions. The old Silk Road, already dangerous, became less reliable. The great trading republics of Venice and Genoa saw their influence wane as Ottoman power expanded. This shift in trade patterns forced European kingdoms to look for alternative routes to Asia. They began to sail westward across the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus, who was born just a few years after the fall, carried letters from a mapmaker who had studied the new geography. His voyage in 1492 and the voyages that followed were driven in part by the need to bypass the Ottoman stranglehold on Eastern trade. The age of exploration and the colonization of the Americas had its roots in that conquest. The Ottoman Empire itself emerged stronger than ever. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became its capital, a thriving center of Islamic culture, commerce, and military power. The Ottomans controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the land routes between Europe and Asia. They would remain a major force in world affairs for the next 4 centuries, challenging European powers on land and sea. The balance of power between East and West had shifted decisively. The Christian world never fully recovered from the loss. The dream of a united Christendom, already fractured, faded further. The fall of Constantinople hardened divisions between Catholic and Orthodox churches and fueled a sense of vulnerability that contributed to religious wars and crusading fervor in the centuries that followed. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of that conquest was the exchange of knowledge. The Greek scholars who fled west did not just preserve ancient texts, they helped ignite a revolution in thought that changed how people saw the world and themselves. In that sense, the fall of one empire gave birth to something new. Yet even as the Renaissance bloomed in Italy, a different kind of violence was about to erupt in France, one driven not by conquest but by faith, a massacre that would stain the streets of Paris with blood and force Europeans to confront the limits of tolerance. In the early hours of August 24, 1572, the bells of Paris began to ring. It was the signal for a planned attack against the city's Huguenot population, French Protestants who had gathered for a wedding celebration. The violence was swift and organized. Armed Catholic mobs, urged on by royal guards, went from house to house, dragging out men, women, and children suspected of being Protestant. The killing did not stop with the morning light. It spread through the streets, across the bridges, and into the surrounding countryside. Over the next several weeks, similar attacks erupted in at least a dozen other French cities, from Lyon to Rouen to Bordeaux. When the bloodshed finally subsided, an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Huguenots had lost their lives. The massacre did not happen in a vacuum. France had been torn apart by religious strife for decades. The Catholic majority and the growing Protestant minority had fought a series of bitter civil wars, each side convinced that the other threatened the future of the kingdom. Into this volatile mix stepped Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother and the real power behind the throne. Her son, King Charles IX, was young and easily influenced. Catherine feared that the Huguenot leader, Admiral Gaspar de Coligny, was gaining too much control over the king. She believed that eliminating Coligny and his followers would restore Catholic dominance and protect her family's hold on power. The wedding of a royal princess to a Protestant prince provided the perfect cover. Thousands of Huguenot nobles had come to Paris for the celebration. They were unsuspecting and concentrated in one place. The massacre that followed was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, although such anger certainly existed. It was a state-sponsored act of religious cleansing, ordered by the crown and carried out with the complicity of city officials and militia. The killings were personal and brutal. Neighbors turned on neighbors, servants informed on their employers. Bodies were thrown into the Seine River, which ran red for days. The Catholic clergy in many cities encouraged the violence, viewing it as a holy duty. For the Huguenots who survived, the trauma was profound. Entire families were wiped out. Their churches were destroyed, their property confiscated. Many fled to England, the Netherlands, or the Protestant states of Germany, taking with them skills and capital that enriched their new homes and weakened France's economy. News of the massacre shocked Europe. Protestant rulers in England and Germany condemned it as barbaric. Even some Catholic monarchs like Philip II of Spain expressed unease, though they did not intervene. The event deepened the divide between Catholic and Protestant nations, hardening attitudes on both sides. In France, the wars of religion resumed with renewed ferocity. The massacre taught other rulers a chilling lesson: that religious difference could be used to justify extreme measures, including the slaughter of unarmed civilians. It set a precedent for state-organized violence against minority groups, a pattern that would be repeated in later centuries, from the persecution of Huguenots under later kings to the pogroms against Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre did not end religious conflict in Europe. It showed how easily political calculation could turn faith into a weapon of mass destruction. As the blood dried on the cobblestones of Paris, the continent braced for more storms of hatred. But the next upheaval would come not from human hands but from the forces of nature itself. A distant volcanic eruption, thousands of miles away, was about to change the global climate and send tremors through empires that no army could match. No army could match the devastation that struck Athens in the year 430 before the Common Era. A mysterious illness swept through the crowded city, trapped behind its walls during the early years of the Peloponnesian War. The population had swelled as refugees from the countryside fled inside for safety, and the close quarters became a breeding ground for a health crisis unlike anything the ancient world had witnessed. Those who fell ill experienced burning fevers, an insatiable thirst, and a sense of overwhelming confusion. Many survivors lost their fingers or their eyesight. Some lost their memory entirely. The disease moved without discrimination through rich and poor, young and old. Within a matter of months, roughly 1/3 of the city's inhabitants had perished. Among the dead was Pericles, the great statesman who had guided Athens through its golden age. His vision had built the Parthenon and fostered the democracy that inspired future generations. With his passing, the city lost its steady hand. Leadership fell to men who were more impulsive, more willing to take risks that would ultimately prove disastrous. The plague did not just kill individuals, it shattered the social fabric that held the city together. No one knew who would be alive tomorrow, so people stopped caring about the consequences of their actions. Law and order broke down. Graves went undug because so many had died that the living could not keep up with the dead. Temples were abandoned, and the traditional rituals that had bound the community for centuries were ignored. Thucydides, an Athenian general and historian who survived the illness himself, wrote a detailed account of what he saw. His description was clinical and precise, focusing on the symptoms, the social collapse, and the moral decay that followed. He wanted future generations to understand what had happened so they might recognize the pattern if it ever returned. That commitment to accuracy and analysis set a new standard for historical writing. Before Thucydides, history was often mixed with myth and divine explanation. He insisted on human causes and eyewitness accounts, a method that historians still use today. The plague contributed directly to Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The city never regained its population or its confidence. Its golden age, the era of Sophocles and Socrates, of drama and philosophy, faded into memory. Athens remained a cultural center for centuries, but its political power was broken. The disease did not just change the outcome of one war, it altered the trajectory of Western civilization, ending the experiment in radical democracy that had flourished for a generation. That pattern, a disease arriving unexpectedly and reshaping the world, would repeat itself many times. The next deadly pandemic was already taking form in the crowded cities of the ancient world, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A health crisis unlike any before it moved across the globe in 3 waves, leaving devastation in its wake. Between 1918 and 1920, a strain of influenza infected an estimated 1/3 of the world's population. The number of lives lost is still debated, but most historians agree that between 50 million and 100 million people passed away during that period. To put that in perspective, the figure far surpassed the casualties of the First World War, which was still raging when the first cases appeared. Soldiers in crowded barracks and troop ships carried the virus from continent to continent, and the war effort ensured that it traveled faster than any previous pandemic. What made this outbreak so disturbing was the speed of its progression. Healthy young adults could wake up feeling fine, develop a fever by midday, and be gone by nightfall. The virus caused a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that filled the lungs with fluid. Patients essentially drowned in their own bodies, sometimes within hours of the first symptom. Hospitals were overwhelmed. In many cities, there were not enough beds, not enough doctors, not enough coffins. Families were forced to dig graves themselves. Schools, theaters, and churches closed their doors. Public gatherings were banned, and people wore masks made of gauze in an attempt to slow the spread. The war itself was both a cause and a victim of the pandemic. Military leaders initially downplayed the outbreak, fearing it would harm morale, but the virus did not discriminate between sides. It swept through German, French, British, and American encampments with equal ferocity. The fighting continued, but armies were weakened. Some historians argue that the pandemic may have hastened the end of the war by exhausting the resources and resolve of all combatants. Yet it also complicated the peace process. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, fell seriously ill with the flu during the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Some scholars believe the illness affected his cognitive abilities and his stamina, making him more susceptible to the harsh demands of the French and British. The treaty that emerged with its punitive terms against Germany sowed the seeds for future conflict. In that indirect way, the pandemic helped shape the political landscape of the 20th century. When the pandemic finally subsided in 1920, it left behind a changed world. The sheer scale of the loss had forced governments to recognize that health was not just a personal matter but a public responsibility. Many nations began to establish or expand their public health systems. Epidemiological surveillance improved. International cooperation on disease monitoring began to take shape. The pandemic also spurred research into vaccines and antiviral treatments, though it would take decades before a flu vaccine became widely available. The memory of the 1918 influenza pandemic faded from public consciousness in the decades that followed, overshadowed by the wars and economic crises that came after. But it remains the most devastating pandemic in recorded history, a stark reminder that nature can disrupt human civilization with terrifying speed. The lessons learned from that crisis eventually led to the creation of the World Health Organization in 1948 and to the global networks that monitor emerging diseases today. That legacy of preparedness born from tragedy has saved countless lives in the years since. Yet even as the world learned to watch for the next viral threat, a different kind of disaster was brewing, one that came not from a microbe but from the very technologies that had promised to improve human life. The next great crisis would be one of human making, a technological catastrophe that would change how the world thought about progress itself. On April 26, 1986, a series of explosions tore through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in what was then the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The roof of the building was blown off, and a plume of radioactive material rose high into the atmosphere, carried by wind across Belarus, Russia, and into much of Europe. The immediate aftermath was chaos. 2 plant workers died that night from the explosion itself, but the true scale of the disaster would not be understood for days and for some for years. The radiation released was immense, hundreds of times more than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, though spread over a much wider area. Firefighters who arrived to extinguish the blaze had no protective gear. They walked directly into clouds of invisible poison, and many of them would die within weeks from acute radiation syndrome, their skin burning, their internal organs failing. The Soviet government initially tried to keep the event secret. Local authorities in the nearby city of Pripyat, home to about 49,000 people, many of them plant workers and their families, were not told the true danger. Children played outside as radiation fell like ash. It was not until April 27th, a full day after the explosion, that the order for evacuation came. Residents were told to bring only a few belongings and that they would return in 3 days. They never returned. In total, an estimated 350,000 people were eventually evacuated from the most contaminated zones, their homes, schools, and entire communities abandoned to the forest and the decay of time. The long-term health consequences have been studied for decades. Among the hundreds of thousands of cleanup workers known as liquidators, rates of thyroid cancer, particularly in children, rose dramatically due to exposure to radioactive iodine. Many liquidators reported chronic illnesses, and the psychological trauma of displacement and uncertainty affected entire families. Birth defects in contaminated regions have been documented at higher rates than normal, though the full picture remains complex and continues to be researched. The disaster did more than poison the land. It exposed the deep flaws in the Soviet system. The government's instinct to hide information, to downplay risks, and to treat its own citizens as ignorant subjects backfired spectacularly. As radiation spread across Europe, scientists in Sweden detected elevated levels and traced them back to the Soviet Union. Only then did Moscow admit what had happened. The secrecy and misinformation eroded public trust not just in the Soviet leadership but in the ideology itself. The disaster became a symbol of the regime's incompetence and its disregard for human life. The political impact was profound. The Chernobyl accident, coming at a time when the Soviet Union was already struggling with economic stagnation, and the costly war in Afghanistan, accelerated the forces that would lead to its collapse. The policy of glasnost, or openness, that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev promoted in the wake of the disaster allowed citizens to speak more freely about the failures of the state. That new openness eventually helped fuel nationalist movements in Ukraine and other republics, movements that would demand independence. 5 years after Chernobyl, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The disaster also transformed the global conversation about nuclear power. In the years that followed, safety regulations were overhauled worldwide, reactor designs were scrutinized, emergency response plans were rewritten, and international cooperation on nuclear safety became a priority. Yet the accident also fueled powerful anti-nuclear movements, particularly in Europe and the United States. Many countries slowed or halted their nuclear programs. Germany, for instance, eventually decided to phase out nuclear power entirely. Chernobyl left a permanent scar on the landscape, a zone of exclusion that remains largely uninhabitable for thousands of years. It also left a deeper scar on the human psyche, a warning about the hubris of thinking that technology could be controlled without consequence. The reactor's core melted down not because of a natural disaster, but because of human error, flawed design, and a culture that punished dissent. That lesson has not been forgotten, even as the world continues to debate the role of nuclear energy in a changing climate. But while Chernobyl was a technological accident born from miscalculation and secrecy, the next disaster was not an accident at all. It was a deliberate act, a man-made famine used as a political weapon to crush a people's will to survive. A different kind of weapon, one that needed no explosives, was already being deployed on the other side of the world. In 1943, the province of Bengal in eastern India experienced a famine that claimed an estimated 3 million lives. The disaster did not come from a single drought or a plague of locusts, though those elements played a role. It came from a combination of wartime policies, colonial neglect, and a system that prioritized war efforts over human survival. At the time, the British Empire was fighting the Second World War, and the Indian subcontinent was a critical staging ground. Allied forces needed food and supplies for their troops, and colonial administrators diverted rice and other grains away from civilian populations to feed the military. At the same time, a cyclone had damaged crops and a fungal disease had infected much of the rice harvest. But the harvest, though reduced, was not as poor as the famine itself suggested. The real problem was distribution and hoarding. Grain merchants, fearing shortages and seeking profit, withheld supplies from markets. Prices soared far beyond what ordinary Bengalis could afford. The British authorities refused to declare a famine emergency. They argued that the market would correct itself, and they feared that diverting food to Bengal would harm the war effort. Even as starvation spread, grain ships bound for Europe continued to leave Indian ports. In the villages of Bengal, the suffering was profound. Families sold their land, their tools, and finally their cooking pots in exchange for a few handfuls of rice. Children grew thin, their bellies swollen from hunger. People ate leaves and bark, and some were reduced to eating the soil. The roads filled with desperate families walking toward the city of Calcutta in search of relief. But relief was slow in coming. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, resisted calls to send grain shipments from Australia or Canada. Churchill reportedly argued that the famine was the result of Indians breeding like rabbits and that any aid would be wasted. His comments revealed a deep prejudice that shaped policy at the highest level. It was not until the winter of 1943, when the worst was already over, that substantial food aid began to arrive. By then, millions had already perished. The famine did more than destroy lives. It shattered any remaining faith among Indians that the British cared about their welfare. For decades, the Indian independence movement had argued that colonial rule was exploitative. The famine made that argument irrefutable. Nationalist leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru pointed to the disaster as proof that Britain could no longer claim moral authority to govern. The question of independence, which had been deferred by the war, now became urgent. Within 4 years, Britain would leave India and the British Raj would end. The legacy of the famine also spread beyond India. The scale of the suffering and the failure of governments to respond led to a global reckoning with food security. After the war, the newly formed United Nations established the World Food Programme in 1961, an agency dedicated to combating hunger worldwide. The famine of 1943 became a cautionary example of how political decisions, not just natural disasters, cause mass suffering. It showed that when governments prioritize war over welfare or ideology over humanity, the consequences can be measured in millions of lost lives. The same pattern, a combination of political failure and environmental stress, would soon repeat itself in another part of the world, one where a similar famine would take an even greater toll. Across the Atlantic, a single crop failure triggered a demographic disaster that would reshape an entire nation. The potato had become the backbone of the Irish diet by the early 19th century. For millions of tenant farmers and laborers, it was nearly the only food they could afford, a cheap, nutritious crop that grew well in the damp Irish soil. But in the autumn of 1845, a fungus later identified as Phytophthora infestans began to spread through the fields. The leaves turned black and the tubers beneath the ground rotted into a slimy, inedible mass. Within days, entire harvests were destroyed. The blight returned the following year and again in 1847, and then again in later seasons. By the time the crisis began to ease in 1852, roughly 1 million people had died from starvation and the diseases that followed in hunger's wake, such as typhus and dysentery. Another million had fled the island, most of them crossing the Atlantic in overcrowded ships bound for the United States and Canada. The British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, responded with a mixture of indifference and ideological rigidity. Officials in London believed that the free market should solve the problem, that food prices would fall if left alone, and that government intervention would create dependency. They also continued to export grain, livestock, and butter from Ireland to England throughout the famine years. In the ports of Cork and Waterford, ships loaded with food sailed past boats carrying starving families who had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, landlords used the crisis as an opportunity to clear their estates of impoverished tenants. Those who could not pay rent were evicted, their cottages knocked down, and they were left to wander the roads or seek shelter in overcrowded workhouses where conditions were barely survivable. The combination of continued exports, inadequate relief, and systematic evictions turned a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. The long-term consequences were profound. Ireland's population, which had been about 8.5 million before the famine, fell to roughly 6.5 million by the end of the decade, and it continued to decline for generations due to emigration and lower birth rates. The Irish language, once widely spoken, retreated to the western fringes of the island as survivors adopted English in hopes of economic opportunity abroad. The cultural and political landscape shifted dramatically. Resentment against British rule, already simmering, boiled over into a powerful nationalist movement that demanded self-government. The famine became a defining memory, a symbol of perceived British neglect and cruelty, and that memory fueled the struggle for independence that would finally succeed in the early 20th century. The wave of emigration created a vast Irish diaspora, especially in the United States, where millions of Irish immigrants faced prejudice but eventually built communities that exercised significant political and cultural influence. The famine also left a scar on the collective Irish psyche, a deep awareness of how fragile survival can be when dependency on a single crop meets a system that values profit over people. Colonial famines, whether in Ireland, India, or elsewhere, stand among the most disturbing examples of systemic neglect, the willingness of distant governments to let whole populations wither while resources remained within reach. And while that famine was a failure of policy and compassion, the next event was something far more deliberate, an organized attempt to erase a culture through forced removal. That deliberate erasure of a people found one of its most chilling expressions in the ancient world, when a great civilization was wiped from the map. For over a century, Rome and Carthage had been locked in a struggle for control of the Mediterranean. The first two Punic Wars had left Carthage crippled but still standing, a once mighty commercial empire reduced to a shadow of its former self. Yet even diminished, Carthage remained a threat in Roman minds. The elder statesman Cotto the Elder ended every speech in the Senate with the same phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." That relentless chant became a policy. In the year 149 before the Common Era, Rome found a pretext. Carthage had violated a treaty by defending itself against a neighbor. The Roman army, led by Scipio Aemilianus, landed in North Africa and demanded that the city be dismantled and its population moved inland. The Carthaginians refused. The siege that followed lasted 3 years. The city was surrounded by walls that had withstood invaders for centuries, but the Romans built a mole across the harbor to cut off supplies. Inside, the defenders held on with desperate courage, melting down statues to forge weapons and weaving fibers from women's hair to make ropes for catapults. But starvation and disease slowly consumed them. When the walls finally fell in the spring of 146 before the Common Era, the Romans did not spare a single building. They set the city ablaze and systematically leveled every structure. The fire raged for 6 days, turning temples, marketplaces, and homes into ash. Thousands of residents who had survived the siege were taken as captives and sold into servitude. The entire population, once estimated at 500,000, was either lost in the fighting, carried away, or scattered into the countryside. The Roman Senate then decreed that the site should never be rebuilt. According to later accounts, the ground was sown with salt so that nothing would grow there again. Whether this story is literally true or a symbolic legend, the intention was unmistakable. Carthage was to be erased from existence, its name a memory, its people a cautionary tale. The destruction of Carthage was not merely a military victory. It was an act of total annihilation, a precedent for what later generations would call total war. Rome did not just defeat an enemy, it eliminated the possibility of that enemy ever rising again. Every archive, every library, every record of Carthaginian civilization was lost. The language of the city, its literature, its laws, and its religious traditions vanished with its people. All that remains are fragments quoted by Roman historians who saw no reason to preserve the culture of their greatest rival. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted permanently. With Carthage gone, Rome had no serious competitor for supremacy. The way was open for the Republic to expand into Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually the entire Mediterranean basin. The destruction set a chilling standard for imperialism, that a conqueror could wipe out not just an army but an entire civilization, leaving nothing but silence behind. For centuries afterward, the fall of Carthage served as a symbol of Roman ruthlessness and of the terrible price of defiance. It echoed through history whenever a great power sought to crush a rival completely, from the Mongol sacking of Baghdad to the bombing of Dresden. The lesson was clear: when Rome decided to destroy, it left nothing standing. That same pattern of total obliteration would reappear centuries later, when another city faced a similar fate during the Middle Ages, a place where the dust of conquest still holds the echo of a vanished world. That same pattern of total obliteration would reappear centuries later, when another city faced a similar fate during the Middle Ages, a place where the dust of conquest still held the echo of a vanished world. But before that, one ancient capital had already fallen to a different kind of invader, one that shocked the entire Roman world to its core. For 800 years, no foreign army had breached the walls of Rome. The city had stood as the eternal symbol of power, law, and civilization. In August of the year 410, that invincibility shattered. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, led his warriors through the Salarian Gate and into the heart of the empire. The sack lasted 3 days. The Visigoths did not come to raze the city to the ground, as the Romans had done to Carthage, but they came to take what they could. They looted temples, stripped statues of their gold, and carried away the treasures of the imperial palace. The bronze roof of the Temple of Jupiter was torn off. Precious works of art, some brought from conquered Greece, were smashed or stolen. Yet the most profound damage was not measured in stolen gold, it was measured in shattered beliefs. The Roman world had long believed that their city enjoyed the protection of the gods and later of the Christian God. The sack forced a painful question. If God was on the side of Rome, how could barbarians be allowed to desecrate the seat of Christendom? Theologians like St. Augustine, still living in North Africa, wrestled with this crisis. He began writing his great work, The City of God, arguing that earthly cities rise and fall, and that true security lies only in the heavenly kingdom. That idea, born from the ashes of Rome, would shape Christian thinking for over 1,000 years. The political impact was equally immense. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by decades of internal decay and economic decline, never fully recovered. Barbarian tribes, once seen as distant threats, now settled within the empire's borders and carved out their own kingdoms. The Visigoths established a kingdom in Gaul and later in Spain, setting a pattern that would repeat across the provinces. The central authority of Rome faded, replaced by a patchwork of local rulers who owed loyalty to no emperor. The sack of Rome did not end the empire overnight, but it marked the beginning of the end. Within 60 years, the last Western emperor would be deposed, and the Roman Empire in the West would cease to exist. The world that emerged was more fragmented, more local, and more dangerous, but also, in some ways, more open to new possibilities. The legacy of that 3-day sack echoed through every later invasion of a capital city, reminding rulers that no wall was impenetrable and no glory eternal. And as the Roman order crumbled, the stage was set for a different kind of encounter, one that would not be about the fall of a city, but about the creation of a new world, a conquest that would open an era of exploitation on a scale that even Alaric could never have imagined. In the heart of Africa, a new kind of empire was built on rubber and cruelty. King Leopold II of Belgium never set foot in the Congo, but he ruled it as his personal possession from the year 1885 until 1908. The Congo Free State, as it was called, was not a colony in the traditional sense. It was a private enterprise, a business venture where the bottom line came before human life. The demand for rubber had exploded in the late 19th century, driven by the bicycle and automobile industries that needed tires and tubes. The Congo was rich in wild rubber vines, and Leopold saw an opportunity to extract enormous wealth. To do so, he created a system of forced labor that turned the entire region into a vast plantation worked by captives. Village chiefs were given impossible quotas. They had to collect a certain weight of rubber each month, or their people would face severe consequences. The enforcement methods were designed to inspire terror. Soldiers from the Force Publique, Leopold Private Army, were sent into villages to ensure compliance. When quotas were not met, they took hostages, often women and children, holding them until the rubber arrived. Those who resisted or failed to deliver were subjected to harsh punishments. The most notorious practice involved the cutting off of hands, a way to prove that a bullet had been used on a person rather than on an animal, since ammunition was carefully accounted for. The severed hands were collected as evidence, and the practice became a symbol of the regime cruelty. The human cost was staggering. Over the course of Leopold's reign, an estimated 10 million Congolese died from a combination of murder, starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Entire regions were depopulated. Villages that had once thrived became ghost settlements. The rubber vines themselves were often destroyed by reckless harvesting methods, leaving the land barren and the people without resources. The suffering was not hidden from the world. Missionaries and travelers who witnessed the atrocities began to speak out. A British consul named Roger Casement traveled through the region and compiled a detailed report. An Irish journalist named Edmund Morle, who had worked for a shipping company and noticed that ships left the Congo loaded with rubber but carried only guns and chains on the return journey, grew suspicious. He left his job and dedicated his life to exposing the truth. The campaign that followed became the first major international human rights movement. Morle founded the Congo Reform Association, and he was joined by prominent figures such as the writer Mark Twain and the author Arthur Conan Doyle. They published pamphlets, gave speeches, and pressured governments to act. Photographs of victims with missing hands and emaciated bodies circulated across Europe and America, shocking the public conscience. The movement forced Leopold to defend his regime, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1908, after years of pressure, the Belgian government finally annexed the Congo, taking control away from the king. Leopold died soon after, his reputation ruined, but the damage to the Congo was permanent. The system of extraction did not end with Leopold. The Belgian state continued to exploit the region for its mineral wealth, and the infrastructure of violence and forced labor that Leopold had built remained in place. The Congo became a colony where the welfare of the people was never the priority. The legacy of that era is still felt today. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, as it is now called, has struggled with political instability, corruption, and conflict for decades. The wealth of its land, rubber, minerals, and rare metals has often been a curse rather than a blessing, drawing in foreign powers and fueling internal strife. The Congo Free State atrocities changed the way the world thought about colonialism. It introduced the idea that private individuals could not be allowed to run entire territories as profit-seeking ventures without accountability. It also set a precedent for humanitarian intervention, the belief that the international community has a moral responsibility to act when a government or ruler abuses its own people. The scale of the violence, organized not by a state but by a corporation in all but name, remains one of the most disturbing examples of what happens when greed is given absolute power. And as the campaign against Leopold was gaining momentum, a similar pattern of exploitation was unfolding in another continent, where a different kind of rubber and a different kind of cruelty was being extracted from the forests of South America. A single act of political violence in the heart of Rome set a pattern for how power shifts through bloodshed. On the 15th of March in the year 44 before the Common Era, a group of Roman senators surrounded Gaius Julius Caesar during a meeting of the Senate and struck him with daggers. He fell at the foot of a statue of his rival Pompey, bleeding from 23 wounds. The assassins called themselves the Liberators, and they believed they were saving the Republic from a man who had become too powerful, a dictator who had crossed the Rubicon and declared himself ruler for life. They thought that by removing him, they could restore the old order where the Senate governed and no single man held supreme authority, but they miscalculated completely. The murder did not bring back the Republic. It plunged Rome into a fresh round of civil wars that would last more than a decade. The people of Rome, many of whom had supported Caesar, were horrified by the killing of their leader in the very chamber where laws were made. Instead of welcoming the liberators as heroes, the public turned against them. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, seized control of the situation by delivering a powerful speech at Caesar's funeral, turning the crowd into a mob that drove the assassins out of the city. The power vacuum was soon filled by Caesar's adopted heir, a young and cunning politician named Octavian. He formed a temporary alliance with Antony and another general, Lepidus, to hunt down the liberators. The resulting battles at Philippi and later at Actium tore the Roman world apart. When the dust finally settled, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. He took the name Augustus, and the Republic, which had existed for nearly 5 centuries, ceased to exist. In its place rose the Roman Empire, a system where one man held ultimate authority and the Senate became a ceremonial body. The assassination of Caesar, intended to preserve the Republic, had the opposite effect. It destroyed the very thing the liberators claimed to protect. The chaos that followed was not a brief storm but a permanent change in the structure of governance. Rome would never again be a republic. The idea that a small group could restore liberty by killing a tyrant proved to be a tragic illusion. Instead, the assassination set a dangerous precedent. It taught future plotters that political murder could be a tool for change, but it also showed that such acts rarely produce the outcome the killers intend. From the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 to the countless other political killings that have shaped history, the ghost of the ideas of March has echoed through the centuries. The Western tradition of governance, with its checks and balances, its fear of concentrated power, and its uneasy relationship with the idea of the strongman, all of that was shaped in part by the blood that spilled on that marble floor. The assassination of Caesar did not just end a life, it ended an era and began a new one, a transition from a government of many to a government of one, a shift that would influence rulers and empires for millennia. And as Rome entered its imperial age, a different kind of violence, one fueled not by politics but by faith, was about to sweep across Europe, leaving a trail of division and destruction that would alter the continent's religious landscape forever. In the spring of 1492, a royal decree changed the course of Spanish history. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, an order that gave the entire Jewish population of Spain a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or leave the kingdom within 4 months. An estimated 200,000 people faced this ultimatum. For centuries, Jewish communities had flourished on the Iberian Peninsula, contributing to its culture, its commerce, and its intellectual life. They had served as physicians, astronomers, translators, and merchants, bridging the worlds of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish thought. That era of coexistence, known as the convivencia, had already been fraying under the pressure of the Inquisition and growing religious intolerance. This decree tore it apart completely. Those who chose conversion were subjected to constant suspicion. The Inquisition, which had been established in 1478, intensified its scrutiny of these new converts, known as conversos. Many were accused of secretly practicing Judaism in their homes, a charge that could lead to torture, imprisonment, or execution in a public ceremony. Those who refused conversion faced a different kind of suffering. They were forced to sell their homes, businesses, and lands at a fraction of their value. They could not take gold, silver, or currency out of the country, so they exchanged their wealth for goods they could carry, only to have those goods seized or stolen along the way. They packed what they could into carts and onto their backs and walked toward the ports, toward the borders, toward an uncertain future. The exodus was chaotic and heartbreaking. Families who had lived in the same town for generations suddenly became wanderers. Some crossed into Portugal, only to face expulsion from there a few years later. Many sailed across the Mediterranean to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II welcomed them, reportedly remarking that he could not understand why the Spanish monarchs would expel such a valuable population. Other refugees found their way to North Africa, to the Balkan provinces of the Ottoman Empire, to the Netherlands, and to cities in Italy and France. The dispersion of Sephardic Jewry, named for the Hebrew word for Spain, created a diaspora that stretched from Salonika to Istanbul, from Amsterdam to Saif. These exiles carried with them a language, Ladino, a form of medieval Spanish mixed with Hebrew and other influences that they preserved for centuries. They also took their skills in finance, trade, and medicine, enriching the lands that received them. The loss to Spain was immense. The departure of so many skilled artisans, merchants, and intellectuals drained the kingdom of a vital part of its economic and cultural fabric. Towns that had depended on Jewish trade networks saw their commerce shrink. The tax base eroded, Spain entered a period of economic stagnation that would last for generations, while its rival nations, particularly the Dutch and the English, welcomed the energy and expertise of the refugees. The Alhambra Decree also hardened the religious identity of Spain. With Jews and Muslims expelled or forced to convert, the kingdom became almost uniformly Catholic. The Inquisition grew in power, monitoring the orthodoxy of even long-standing Christians. This obsession with religious purity, what later historians would call the limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, created a society where ancestry determined opportunity. Anyone with Jewish or Muslim heritage, no matter how distant, could be barred from public office, from universities, from guilds. The fear of contamination poisoned social relations and stifled innovation. The political consequences echoed across Europe. The expulsion demonstrated how a state could use its authority to enforce religious uniformity, and it set a precedent for later waves of persecution, from the expulsion of the Moriscos in the early 17th century to the pogroms against Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. It also reshaped the map of global Judaism, moving the center of Jewish life from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ottoman Empire and to the growing communities of Northern Europe. That shift had long-term implications for trade, for diplomacy, and for the development of early modern capitalism. The intolerance that drove this expulsion did not fade with time. It continued to fuel suspicion, segregation, and violence against minority groups across the continent. The same forces that tore apart the diverse society of medieval Spain would soon find new targets elsewhere, as intolerance evolved into new forms of persecution that would reshape the religious and political landscape of Europe once again. A century and a half later, a very different kind of fear swept through a small colonial town. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem in Massachusetts Bay Colony became the epicenter of a crisis that would haunt the American imagination for centuries. It began with a handful of young women who started behaving strangely, falling into fits, claiming to be pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Local physicians could find no natural cause, and soon the community turned to a supernatural explanation: witchcraft. The accusations multiplied with astonishing speed. The first 3 women arrested were social outcasts: a slave named Tituba, a homeless beggar, and a poor widow who rarely attended church. But the net quickly widened to include respected members of the community, prosperous farmers, churchgoers, and even a former minister. By the time the hysteria subsided, more than 200 people had been accused and 20 had been executed, 19 by hanging and 1 pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. The legal proceedings were deeply flawed. The court allowed something called spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to the witness in a dream or vision to torment them. This was evidence that could not be verified or challenged. Accusers could claim to see the specter of the defendant committing acts of malice, and the defendant had no way to disprove it. The court also relied on confessions obtained under pressure, often from those who were promised leniency if they named others. This created a chain reaction of accusations, each new name feeding the frenzy. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families against their own members. The jails filled and the town's social fabric unraveled. Behind the hysteria lay deeper tensions. Salem village was divided between wealthy farmers and poorer families, between those who supported the more conservative church leadership and those who resisted. The community was also recovering from a smallpox epidemic, recent attacks by Native American forces, and political uncertainty as the colony's charter was being renegotiated. Fear of the unknown, of illness, of outsiders, of change, all of it found a channel in the witch trials. Religious fervor intensified the panic, with Puritan ministers warning that the devil was walking among them. The trials became a way to explain misfortune and to enforce social conformity. By the autumn of 1692, the hysteria began to collapse under its own weight. Prominent figures, including the wife of the governor, were accused. When the governor's own family was threatened, he dissolved the special court and ordered a halt to the arrests. The remaining accused were released, and the community was left to reckon with what it had done. Many of the accusers later recanted. Some admitted they had lied or been mistaken. The judge who presided over the trials, Samuel Sewall, publicly apologized and spent the rest of his life in penance. The event so disturbed the Puritan leadership that it effectively ended witch hunts in the American colonies. Legal standards were reformed, and spectral evidence was never again accepted in a Massachusetts court. The Salem witch trials stand as a powerful warning about the dangers of fear-based justice. When a community becomes convinced that an invisible enemy is among them, when accusations are treated as proof, and when the legal system abandons its safeguards, ordinary people can become persecutors. The same psychological dynamics have appeared again and again in history, from the Red Scare of the 1950s to more recent episodes of moral panic. Salem reminds us that the machinery of injustice can run on the fuel of collective fear, and that the most dangerous thing a society can do is to let that fear override reason and compassion. As we look back across these 30 events, a pattern emerges. They share a common thread: the moment when ordinary safeguards collapse, when fear or greed or ideology overwhelms restraint. Whether through disease, conquest, political violence, or mass hysteria, each of these events reshaped the world not only through immediate suffering but through the lasting changes they forced upon human institutions. The Black Death broke the chains of feudalism. The Mongol conquests redrew trade routes. The transatlantic slave trade built economies on a foundation of exploitation. The Holocaust gave birth to international human rights law. And here in Salem, a small village panic helped refine the very idea of a fair trial. These events are not merely tragedies to be remembered. They are turning points that taught lessons, sometimes the hard way, about how fragile civilization can be and how carefully it must be guarded. The question is not whether such crises will come again, but whether we will remember the patterns well enough to avoid repeating them. These 30 events trace a map of human failure and human endurance. Across centuries and continents, the same patterns surface again and again: fear that curdles into persecution, greed that justifies exploitation, ideology that overrides compassion. Each catastrophe left behind not only ruins and loss but also lessons written in the ashes. The Black Death cracked open feudalism and gave birth to new social mobility. The transatlantic slave trade built global economies while forcing the world to confront the meaning of human rights. The Holocaust led to international laws that hold leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. The Salem witch trials refined legal standards and taught a young nation to distrust fear-driven justice. Every tragedy, no matter how dark, pushed humanity to rethink its structures, its ethics, and its vulnerabilities. But none of these changes came easily. They came because survivors refused to let the suffering be forgotten. They came because people documented, testified, and demanded accountability. They came because ordinary individuals chose to learn from horror rather than repeat it. The capacity for cruelty is part of the human story, but so is the capacity for resilience. Communities shattered by genocide rebuilt their identities in exile. Nations torn apart by conquest found ways to preserve their languages and memories. Families displaced by famine carried their traditions across oceans and planted them in new soil. That resilience is what makes the study of history not just a lesson in pain but a source of strength. The world we live in today, with its human rights frameworks, its international courts, its public health systems, its scientific understanding of disease, is built directly on the ruins of these events. We are the beneficiaries of those who suffered and those who insisted on change. That is a sobering responsibility. It means we cannot afford to look away from the darkest chapters. Ignorance is not protection. Only awareness can guard against repetition. So the question that lingers after this countdown is not simply which event disturbed you the most. It is what you will do with that disturbance. Will you let it settle into passive horror, or will it sharpen your understanding of the world? Will you recognize the early warning signs when fear is weaponized, when neighbors are turned against each other, when institutions begin to abandon their safeguards? History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. Those echoes are all around us. If this journey through the past has taught you something new, or if it has stirred a thought you want to share, leave a comment below telling us which event left the deepest impression on you. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden corners of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are always more stories waiting to be uncovered. The past is not done with us. It is only through remembering the worst of what we have done that we can hope to build something better. That is the work of every generation. Thank you for walking through these shadows with us.